Hello and welcome. Really happy to have all of you with me today and everyone in the audience joining us today out there. I'm Josh Aaron. I'm the CEO of Aiden. Aiden is focused on elevating the experience people have with IT by applying AI to the age-old problems of keeping computers up to date and patching them, building them from scratch into a consistent desired state configuration, and maintaining them throughout their life cycle. This event series that we're running is focused on bridging the gap between IT and cybersecurity. We call it the IT security paradigm shift. And we're all about trying to create winning alignments in today's complex organizations in an area that too often people don't even talk about, can have some conflict in it because they have different priorities. Today, we're going to be discussing budgeting for 2022 in light of the tremendous uncertainty that's out there. We know a lot of IT leaders are feeling that these days. There are certainly challenges in cybersecurity land. There are challenges in IT operations, and we're going to be talking about how to think about those things as we all go into this budget cycle, which is so critical for having a great next year. Hopefully everyone can see my screen. We do have a quick agenda here. We're going to be providing some resources, which I'll get to in a second. We are going to do panelist introductions for you, and then we're going to dive right into the discussion. And at the end, we'll try to wrap it up a little for you with some final thoughts and key takeaways. The resources that I'm going to go to now, we are going to be sending out. You don't have to document any of this. This is all going to be sent out to you at the end of the event. There'll be the event Q&A from the stream, blurred lines and blind spots report that just came out from HP and HP Wolf, which has a lot of interesting things as we start thinking about budgeting. And some benefits of running tabletop exercises in budgeting. A lot of us have done that in cybersecurity and incident planning and event management, but many people haven't done that in budgeting, and we think there's tremendous value there as well. And with that, let me dive right into introducing the panelists. Bill Murphy is the managing partner of Cresting Wave, and Bill, I'm going to go to you first. Can you give us a little background?
Sure. Great to meet everybody. I'm managing partner at Cresting Wave. Cresting Wave, we curate innovations for technology leaders. We all know that everybody's like inundated with marketing and all kinds of other inbound that makes it hard to discern what new solutions to take a look at. We match solutions specifically to the environments that you all have in order to create a better experience of that, really critical part of your job, innovation discovery that never gets enough time or energy. So that's what we're doing now. Prior to this, I was the CTO of Blackstone for a decade, where I ran internal technology as well as our strategic investing platform. And prior to that, I was one of the founding team at Capital IQ. So I'm really excited to talk through the topic with Josh and all the panelists today.
Thank you, Bill. And Keith, I'm going to go to you next. Keith Moss, Managing Director and CTO at PAMCO.
All right, thanks, Josh. Hi, everybody. It's great to be here. Nice to meet everyone. So as Josh said, so I'm the CTO at a company called PAMCO or PAMCO Prisma. We're an asset manager. We manage around $10 billion. We're small. We're about 50 people. So I think what's interesting for me is that I represent sort of small company and smaller company perspective on how you solve this problem. Prior to this, I was at KKR, and PAMCO Prisma was a spin out from KKR. I spent a decade on the IT group in private equity, similar to Bill. So that was the inverse, where things were big, right? Big company, big organization, big budget, different risk tolerance. So kind of the compare contrast of the experiences, I think, is going to be interesting as we have this conversation. So thanks for having me.
Thank you, Keith. Really happy to have you with us today. And lastly, but not least, I'm going to go to my main man from One Main, Tunde Oni Daniel. Tunde, you and I have had a lot of conversations. I know you run cyber technology as well as network services, so you sit right at the intersection of a lot of this. Why don't you give people a little bit of your background?
Thank you very much, Josh, and the rest of the panelists. Yes, my name is Tunde Oni Daniel. I'm in a very beautiful organization called One Main Financial. We are the #1 lender for consumers in a particular niche part of the market to enable them in very difficult times and help them in that financial literacy journey to get better as far as from a financial perspective. So we find ourselves in multiple parts. We are on a multi-year journey on how we diversify ourselves. We are a one-year 100-year-old organization and have been doing this for quite a while. But we have a product set that is definitely differentiation in the market and doing a lot of very, very interesting things. So when you think about that from that perspective, driving cyber data protection and things like that, you realize that assets and understanding how to put together what you're trying to solve for becomes very, very important. So it's always very interesting. I love sitting across the table of folks that have been CTO and me representing cyber for us to kind of highlight the dichotomy between tech-driven decisions and cyber-driven conversations. But this is going to be fun.
That's great. Tunde, we're really happy to have you with us today and glad you can make the time as well. And I'm going to dive with that right into our questions for today's panel. The first question I'm going to address to each of you across the board here, because I think before we start looking forward, it's always helpful to look back a little bit. And so the question is, what are some key takeaways, some learnings from the 2021 cycle that you are planning to take with you into the 2022 budget cycle? And Tunde, why don't we just keep going with you? Why don't you go first?
Absolutely. So, I mean, if you think about 2021 was kind of that pivotal point where trying to figure ourselves as an organization, our journey, and the things we wanted to do. So, IT budgeting was kind of a very, very important theme as we think about layering the right controls over enabling our business. And so it becomes a big topic to really think through enablement versus risk controls and things like that could be very, very challenging. But we learned a lot about ourselves as to how we prioritize things and really get the lens of what do us as an IT or a technology organization or a technology business really position ourselves to think differently when it comes to really enabling our customer. And one of those things that becomes very, very important for the customer case that we want to get them to get the best product out to them, get it to them securely, and at the same time, get them the right experience. And all those things have to be considered, even from a cybersecurity perspective. So knowing how to position those conversations as a customer enabler, and from a cybersecurity perspective, becomes always very interesting topic of how do you position yourself. But so 2021 allowed us to learn a lot about ourselves from that perspective and building a very, very good journey for 2022 for sure.
Absolutely. I mean, we know that some of the natural competing priorities there are obviously in cybersecurity. We want to lock things down. But as I always say, the IT manager side, right? The CIO, CTO side, the network management side, we want to create more flexibility, convenience, and utility for people. And those two things often are just naturally flying in the face of each other. How do we bring the experience forward to create the best customer experience and best customer enablement? With that, I'm going to turn to you, Keith, next. How are you thinking about lessons learned from 2021 and what you're bringing into the budget cycle for 22?
So, for us and probably for honestly the whole world, 2021 taught us we can work from home, we can work remotely, right? So half of our firm is still remote. We, I think it also showed us that there can be long payoff cycles in some of the investments that we make. So back in 2017, 2018, we made a big move into the cloud, and that really paid off when we had to pivot to work from home. And it paid off with all of the remote access. It really enabled the decentralization and at the same time helping us maintain control, as Tunde was saying. I think, we made some investments in cyber this year, some of that urgently as we moved in deeper into the remote model. So as we move kind of into next year, things I think about are continuing the investment in cyber, certainly as an enabler. It's honestly been an easy conversation this year. I think everybody understood it, that we needed to protect, and that we are potentially perceived at higher risk because we're more remote than we used to be. So we're pursuing more of a zero trust model in that regard. Sorry, my phone just distracted me for a second there. And last thing I mentioned is, I think this has also really shed a light on simplicity. So a big theme for us next year is simplification. And how can we just do more with less? And a phrase we used to say at KKR, how do we keep the main thing the main thing?
That's a very good point. And actually, perfect segue. Bill, you and I have had a lot of these discussions this year about how do we keep the main thing, right? What are those main priorities? What are some of the things you saw in 2022 across Cresting Waves customers and everyone that you're talking with, that really you see as themes going into,
Well, I think
informing?
that, yeah, the last 2 years have taught us that nimbleness and like the ability. I sort of always think about like George Clooney and Up in the Air, and he talked about how much weight he had in his backpack, and the more weight he had in his backpack prevented him from moving. So he was always like, I keep a light backpack, he had nothing in his apartment, he could move around, right? And I think technology management is about trying to keep your backpack as light as you can, because that enables your business to be nimble and to move around. And COVID was a perfect example. Is like the people who didn't have a heavy backpack and were using cloud services and could easily deploy to remote and had made the investments that were like that lighten the load, were able to adapt so much faster than those that weren't, right? And I think so everybody is generally coalescing around this, like, how do I lighten the load of legacy and how do I do it? Now, I don't think that there's an easy answer to this, because everybody also has like, man, that's expensive to actually do the hard work to lighten the load in a lot of cases. And so it can be very, very daunting. And I would definitely echo Keith's point around simplicity. I think sometimes people don't double click enough into the complexity and look for simple solutions. And I guess is a little bit, serving of Aiden, because like the simplicity of your solution is actually, it's like a cool way to improve something that maybe people feel like they have handled to some degree, but it's like an easy way to simplify out a bunch of complexity you never have to worry about again. Lighten your backpack, right? And then, that can make you able to spend more time on those main things that you talked about. So I think making sure that you look at the tech debt and with a critical eye and improve stuff, even the stuff that you think may be okay. How do you get that to great? Because that'll enable you to be that much more nimble and focused on the things that are super important for your business.
Thank you. Yeah, I heard you all talk about this a little bit when I think about all those comments, kind of like things take time, right? And you have to dig into the complexity and you have to be willing to make investments that may have long payback cycles. And that leads right into my next question, which is, how do you guys think about time to payback? Like particularly when you're designing a budget for longer range initiatives and you want to sell that to the leadership, how do you do that? And Bill, maybe you want to continue and then we'll go on to everybody.
Yeah, totally. I mean, and I think this is the biggest mistake that everybody makes. And I struggled, in all the companies that I've been on the board of and been inside, is like, how do you elevate the conversation to be around a much more realistic payback period for technology, so that it's not viewed as an expense, it's viewed as an investment? Because technology, I mean, at like Google or Facebook or something, technology is the business, right? But for most companies, technology is an enabler of other parts of the business, right? So if I make accounting, 50% more efficient by deploying a great piece of software, that's going to make the tech budget go up, but you're going to save an enormous amount of money on the other side, right? But the way that budgeting tends to be done in corporate America is by department. So it's like, well, tech keeps spending more money. And it's like, yeah, but I just saved the finance department like a dramatic amount. So you have to, I think, try to reframe the ones that are truly investments versus the ones that are operating expenses, and then draw out the time frame so that people can really have a debate about the payback of those investments, instead of just thinking that they're run the business type of a problem. And the other piece that I think screws with everybody on this is like OpEx versus CapEx. Years ago, everything that was an investment over multi-years was CapEx. But now with the way that SaaS is deployed and the way that the iterative cycle of development, where things go into production quickly and then just keep getting better, your ability to capitalize software is like way lower than it used to be by accounting principles. So everybody's just assumes everything's run the business. So I think you got to get out of the accounting way of thinking and elevate it to like, okay, drive the narrative yourself about what's investment for the future and what's run the business. And then you can lead a good dialogue about that. But it takes a certain level of storytelling and not just putting numbers on a page in the same format that you did last year.
That's a great point. And Tunde, I know you and I have talked about this quite a bit, actually. How is this working at OneMain? What are the things you're bringing to the board and key constituents in the organization? And how are you articulating the investment and the ability to get them to get focused on the investment and a reasonable payback, right? How are you doing that?
So I love the way Bill positioned the point, because I think I'm going to build on what Bill said. The reality is technology has struggled in being able to quantify items or investments from the perspective of how does it roll in. Now, cybersecurity has always been seen as a cost center historically, where it's things that are sunk in and I pay and I don't see what I'm doing because it doesn't give me the bottom line. But Bill turned the conversation a bit, and I love the way he hit it, was it's not about the fact that you're spending something, you're saving cost. So the return on that investment is what we need to be deliberate about highlighting that. So one of the things that we've kind of done with help across our team is really taking that ROSI model and using that to build out OPEX, CAPEX, it doesn't matter, but thinking forward and saying, okay, what is the return of the things that you're doing? How are you driving those improvements, and how are you seeing those indirect benefits? But it's really about understanding the business better and really learning that those indirect benefits that you add in. And on the experience set perspective, think about customer retention. And I'm a cyber guy, so you can say that. It's funny, huh? But think about customer retention. If the experience for your customer to log into your platform is better, streamlined, and more simplistic, then customer retention is strengthened, but that's a cybersecurity control. So, but you've simplified, enhanced experience for the customers so they can actually liken the way they authenticate to your platforms. Then there will be people that will draw to your platform. So being able to have those conversations becomes a very, very good
Tunde, question for you. Do you find that it's, especially for engineers and accountants and people who are like used to precision on numbers, do you find that you have a hard time getting people to say, what's the value of this? Where you're, because there is no measurement, right? What's the expected future value of that enhancement that you just talked about? So how do you deal with that? Because I think it's critical that guesses are made and educated guesses are made, but I don't know if you've seen the same thing.
I've seen that very, very, because think about it. An engineer is an engineer is an engineer. He understands the roadmap of the sprints and the things of what we want to get to. And from a vision set perspective, this is how we want to get to that destination of the final product that we want to get to. And they think in those particular models, and the tech debt that comes from any wrong decision has to also be identified through that journey. And that was part of what Keith kind of talked about in the journey to the cloud kind of situation, where making the right decisions about those iterations to give further benefit in the future is not something that comes naturally. So it's a combined effort where it's a shared brain power of finance and business and technologists and engineers to come together to kind of build that cohesion around the message. Because truthfully, one area cannot convey the message completely. You have to be able to sell the value of the innovation on top of the features, on top of what the product team gets to sell to the team about what they're going to get, about what enhancements needs to look like. I mean, I call it team sport. From being prior military, it makes sense for me because I love team kind of work. But in this particular sense, to be able to get to the right message, it's a team sport. Getting to understanding different parts of what that value is based on the innovation or the iteration that's actually being done.
That's really interesting, Tunde. I'm going to skip around a little based on what you just said, and I'm going to bring it to you, Keith. But then I'd like to hear from you also, Tunde, on this. How do you prepare different budgetary presentations for different audiences? Like, you just mentioned it's a team sport, but you got to present to all the different teams, and they've all got different
agendas.
Different agendas. The value proposition is different to different teams. How do you work on preparing your budget? And Keith, I'd love to hear your experience. Like how are you doing that to steer your presentations based on who you're presenting to?
So for me, and remember, we're small, right? So, I mean, our process, the heads of state, we get in the room and I present the budget, right? So I kind of have everybody there at the same time. The way I organize it is, back to what I think Bill might have said too, I break it down between what's operating costs for IT versus investments in IT. Big investments typically go through like a business case kind of process, which would happen separately and before. And that's my word, I think, to wrap what Tunde was saying, kind of team sport, right? This is where we try to understand the total cost of ownership of the solution and the total benefit of it, right? And really articulate, why are we doing it? What are we going to get? And effectively figure out, what are we going to measure to know that, in fact, we got what we thought we would get, right? So that sort of happens a little separately. It all bakes together into what I call FP&A, right? And I go in and I show kind of spend year over year, trending cut out by categories, operating versus investment. And I attribute it, directly to my pieces of the business, right? And that actually has some brain damage because I pulled data out of our general ledger, God help me. But mapping, what is Aiden's invoice for, right? And being able to articulate that it directly maps to something in the business as opposed to just something in IT, right? And then, with all that data on hand, I think I'm armed to have the conversation, right? And to help people understand. Ideally, I'm trying to drive down operating costs in IT, and that helps me sell increase in investment spend in IT.
It's really interesting. Just the words you use, Keith, is like, it's selling, it's storytelling, and it's putting the materials together that enable you to do that. 100%. It's sort of funny that, we all worked hard in technical, with technical knowledge so that we could become salespeople and change managers on a regular basis. But that's what it is, right? The one point I would make, and I'd love to get the other people's thoughts on this, is like, COVID led people to change way faster than they thought was possible, right? I think Satya Nadella said like 5 years worth of technical change in 6 months or something like that, because everybody went to home and so on. I certainly saw that. A bunch of people that we were talking to, it's like everybody suddenly got religion and learned how video conferencing works, right? After pushing back on it for years. And, do you think that's going to lead to a different type of conversation and like more people more open to dramatic changes? Because it is amazing how expensive something is when it's done in a slow, methodical, completely risk-averse way versus when, when you rip the Band-Aid off technically and make big changes, like you can do things so fast, but obviously there's risk associated. Or maybe Tunde, maybe you want to comment on this too, because cyber risk is such a big deal.
Jump in for 1 second. I just want to point out, I can't tell you how many times as a CTO in private equity, I heard we'll never get rid of our phone systems, right? So what you just said, and now that everybody's working from home, I've talked to like 5 private equity peers who are saying, for the first time ever, we're considering going to like a Microsoft Teams phone platform, right? So absolutely this paradigm shift is happening, right?
Josh, we use Zoom for phones.
Right, Zoom for phones, Teams for phones. Like, do I need a physical phone ever anymore, right?
So let me bring all parts together. So if you think about what Bill said and what Keith said and what you just added, Josh, I mean, Bill is completely astute, as change before has become so dysfunctional and does not match current state, because based on the things we've done over the last 18 months, we have proven that it can be done differently, and it can be done deliberately, and it can be done without adding additional friction and complication for the organization, that we're doing it faster and iterating change. So the old agile principle actually does work and is applicable, because if you try it, it does work. The storytelling of what Bill was talking about there, it's how do you sell that for people to understand? It's data driven. You have to let the data prove it. So our time in the last 18 months has proven to us, definitely, it does work. We have data and metrics that shows that if you change legacy technology and move to something more modern, it actually enables you to do things faster, enables you to get access to people quicker. Now, not only do I have to be in an office to use my phone, I can use my work phone or my cell phone while I am in a different location. I'm not time bound to a particular geographic location to be able to work. So all those things have become this new change scenario that's happened. I did a course during COVID as well, talking about accelerating change during this particular DNA kind of, and it really comes to changing our DNA on how do we drive change. If this, and everybody uses the term digital transformation, but truthfully, this has been a continuum of digital transformation for us all, where we've been transformed to do things, and the constraints have been removed, and it's boundaryless. But we just have to be able to use the data to share why and how it is actually working for us all. I hope I pulled it together.
No, it's absolutely what's happening.
I just want to add in, if it's okay.
What are you seeing? Yeah.
I just want to add in one thing here. So, or two thoughts. Completely agreeing, like COVID broke a lot of glass, right? And it suddenly, I think, made a lot of the business leadership open to questioning and challenging some of their base assumptions, right? It began with, we're going home, working from home, this is terrible, to, 3 weeks later, CEO called me and said, wow, this works. It works well. Wow, we're pretty productive. Hey, what if we close the office? How would you feel? Right? Like, talk about a 180 over 4 weeks of time.
Did you get a raise out of that, Keith? They gave you a big one-time bonus for all of your amazing work, right?
That's right. It's coming. It's coming. Right? Let's just keep.
You got
keep
a huge
waiting.
budget increase too, Bill.
Right. They
They
showed so much appreciation for your foresight.
What I wanted to challenge, though, was that I think the radical change and the fast change is awesome. And maybe you guys have thoughts on how and where, but I challenge, I think there's still parts of the business where, like, you can't change an accounting system fast. I don't think you can, based on what it is, or maybe I just do it wrong. So I feel like there's probably, pick spots where it makes some sense. And it also, I think a little bit about, depending upon the organization, what's the culture and the risk tolerance. Like, some organizations go easy and they're okay with a little more failure, and other places expect like perfect white glove. God forbid you have anything wrong, you get shot, right? And I think, we've lived in some of them too. So I feel like that plays in. But how do you guys think about that?
I mean, I hope that the COVID thing has changed some, and at least opened up people to the concept of the more radical approach to change, right? Where you're just like, where it's cold turkey, and you make some good changes there. I do think I think sometimes technologists limit ourselves because people make assumptions. Well, no one would ever do that without really pressing it. So hopefully also the tech leaders will press those possibilities a little bit more with people.
Yeah,
because
how do you sell that because of what's happening? Almost a Me Too here, right? Like, Me Too, everybody's changing stuff. We need to change stuff too. These are things you guys were unwilling to look at before. I'm raising them again, right? Like, how do our CIOs, CTOs, CISOs, how do we start to sell that into the executive leadership and the boards of the organizations, that we really need to take a fresh look at this, right?
Well, I think what Tunde said about value is clearly, right? Like, so that sales has to come with listen, we're going to improve how we run our infrastructure, which is going to enable us in 2023 and 2024 to lower our FTE projections or do 3 other projects that wouldn't get done otherwise for the same cost. And like, you got to show that specifically in the metric. The other thing that I would say that we don't do very well as typical as an industry is do bottom-up budgeting, really questioning all the expenses of the past. Like like you said, like the phone system, or your existing patching system, or your existing operating system.
25-year-old accounting system, which is going to take years to shift, but we've got to start. What's that old adage? Like, if
you don't start, you can't finish.
Commercial right now on TV, right? I think it's Google or Amazon, right? If you don't start, Facebook, if you don't start, nothing amazing will happen, right? Like, we have to push this conversation.
But I think it is. So I know in financial industry, we have a term called know your customer. I've put in a know your audience in my strategy because, and I think it goes back to the earlier point of saying there is a particular lens of what data you're sharing to a particular audience that you need to make sure it gets delivered. I can say the same thing three different ways to three different audiences to hit the bone of what exactly they're looking for to get value out of it. So how I talk to a risk officer versus a technology officer versus a finance person around the same capabilities that we're trying to do is all different. Same message, I mean, same overall data point, but the way it's delivered is different. So what Bill is saying, and what I'm agreeing to vehemently, is we need to change how we communicate. We need to be able to change how we plan ourselves and how we communicate ourselves to ensure that we're saying the right things and able to meet what we've committed to do.
It's a great point, and no matter how much we all work on it, and I know, gentlemen, that we all do, a lot of times there's this perception, and this isn't one of my off-the-cuff questions. This is just something that came to mind, that somehow as IT leaders, we're never going to be quite as good communicators as the other members of the executive body. And, you know, how do you figure out when you've hit the bone, as you said, Tunde?
Well,
right?
well, I think that, you know, first of all, I give bone to pick on that. I think, to give our tech leaders credit, like,
yes,
our business is way more complicated, and there's less knowledge about it. Like, you know, why is it okay for non-technologists to come to a meeting and go, I don't know anything about technology. I don't even know how my phone works. And people do that and they laugh about it. And it's like, okay. But imagine if you guys walked into a meeting and you were like, I don't know how any of these numbers work, like revenue, ha, ha, ha. They'd laugh you out of the room. Yeah. So anyway, it's so complicated, and people don't have an understanding that that's what creates that gap, for sure.
There is that perception, and that brings me to one of my prepared questions, which is, you know, I call it the Inflight magazine inquiries. How do you deal with it when that same person you just described, Bill, read something in a publication somewhere and they come into the room and they go, now I'm the technology expert. I read that every organization needs to be doing X, Y, and Z, and you're the leader of IT here, or you're the leader of cybersecurity here. Why aren't we doing this yet?
You take up meditation or something. I don't know.
So Tunde, how do you deal with those? And you know they happen all the time, right? It happens all the time.
So maybe I'm reading too many books or just paying too much attention. But there's a particular thing about how do I influence without having the right authority in the room. So I need to influence people by being able to convey the data points around my message to them in a way they would get it. I mean, and I think Bill kind of alluded to this point. We as technology leaders have morphed. We were thinking more bits and bytes, dynamic information, connectivity. That's how we communicated ourselves before. But we've become savvy in the terms of the business and understanding business value from a technology perspective. Keith's talking about return on investment, FP&A, and he's a technologist. So we've changed our lingo to be able to have a seat at that table to have the right conversations. So we just need to be able to drive the influence. And that's really it. Influencing the conversation, stimulating the conversation to show the why. Why do we need to do this? Why is that Inflight magazine proposal about the technology to choose is not the right one? That we're not coming in and saying, you don't know what you're talking about. What are you talking about? Well, I'm the technologist in here, but rather than taking that approach, but really having the educated conversation to say, okay, these are data points around what you've seen, good information to gather. Here's why it makes sense, and here's why it doesn't make sense. And based on those pros and cons, being able to help drive the right decision, influencing them with the right data points to make the right decisions.
Look, and what we're really talking about is being challenged, right, against our presentations that we prepare on the budget. And Keith, how do you defend your presentations or all of your numbers and everything else? I am sure you've gotten this before. How do you deal with, having to defend it, particularly against the audience that may not know as much about the technology as you do, that espouses to understand it because they read it somewhere or heard it from a friend?
Look, it's a constant. I was going to joke, we defend it vehemently with violence when necessary. I think that there's some indirect elements to it too. I was going to go back to where you were, Tunde. I think that, the influencing, it's just, as you said, it's ongoing, right? So it's finding opportunities to have your own marketing campaign, to continue to explain the strategy and repeat the strategy. And that may not happen at the moment somebody tries to ambush you with the Inflight magazine, right? But you're controlling enough airwaves so that you have the credibility. So when that comes up, you're already one leg up because you have a plan and you've explained the plan and people are bought in on the plan. And then when the specific thing comes at you, depending upon what it is, you're going to hope that you have enough knowledge and you've canvassed wide enough that you can speak intelligently about it, so you can explain where it fits or doesn't fit. A specific strategy, sometimes I'll take them down into the details. Like, all right, genius, let's go. Right? And let's go all the way down into whatever it is in Active Directory and why. And then they're like, I'm out. And I'm like, yep, I win. Sometimes, right?
Does that work for you? Like when you've done this, if you drive them down into the details to the point where they say, uncle, does that, I've done that a few times. It's not my favorite way to do it, but like what's the most effective way to get them on your side, to bring them over?
I think the transparency is clearly, like, if there was one thing that I look back at my career and say, like, I should have been better, or I should have learned it earlier, was like, keep talking and keep being patient and keep working people through things. And when you're under time pressure and you're feeling like you need to deliver something, it's like oftentimes the thing you want to do absolutely least. You'd rather just blow your brains out versus like say the same things over and over again. But it's the only way to build that consensus around what you're doing, why you're doing it, and then get people on your side. And like, I'm sure I could have done it a ton better in my career, but like, and we're all prideful, right? And it's like, we don't want to have to explain the same thing 10 times. We want them to just trust us. We want to do all those things. And you have to like fight that with all of your being, because ultimately it's like it's something that it heads you down the wrong path to get your own stuff done. So lots of transparency and lots of storytelling over and over again, often the same story. Be patient, keep doing it, and it pays off.
And building on past success. If you've accomplished enough and you've been able to deliver for them, past success becomes your resume to say, I've done it before in the past. We've gotten there. We will get there. So past success also becomes a very good selling point.
Memories are short though, Tunde, and I'll challenge that one a little bit. I think past success, if it's recent past success in the organization you're currently in, can give you some credibility.
Yeah.
But I'll tell you what I learned in PE definitely does not work, is trying to explain past successes you've had anywhere outside that organization.
True.
We don't care. It's not work here, right? You immediately come up against that one. That was a lesson I learned in my career, at some point. And I'm just saying, you have to be careful how you use past success, right?
Well, I do think that like it's the lesson there is that when you're presenting your budget, you're presenting yourself. When you're presenting your plan for Office 365, you're presenting yourself. When you're presenting in front of the board your cybersecurity plan, you're presenting yourself, because they're not betting on your plan, they're betting on you. And like so that storytelling and that budgeting is not, I think we often get so caught up in being right as tech leaders, right? And the content, that we forget that our management is just saying to themselves, do I trust Bill? Do I trust Josh? Do I trust Tunde and Keith? They're not saying like, do I believe that this phishing solution is going to really make our thing this much better and less risky? They're just saying, is he making a case such that I believe him and then I'll just let him do it?
Yeah, it's very similar when I was pitching investors for this business a year ago.
100%. They're investing in you and your team more than they're investing in, a specific idea, because everything pivots.
And one of the things I was told, Bill, is that very clearly, they're not just looking at you from the lens of, and this is the same with our IT leadership, right? They're not looking at you just from the lens of, do you have the perfect plan? They want to know, are you listening? Are you flexible? Are you coachable? Are you really paying attention and going to go back and think about it? And you have to, in my view, park ego and lead from that place, or you get yourself into a lot of trouble in budget conversations. I've led strategic investing advice, and in the small companies that we talk to, it's like the number one predictor of success was the ability to listen, and not necessarily listen to the point of like
listen to the next thing and change direction completely, and then listen to another thing and change back, but just openness to feedback and believing that they don't have all the answers is absolutely critical in, I think, any executive that, in today's world. And the minute you find somebody who has all the answers, you probably want to run the other way.
So now I want to switch over to having all the answers. So when we all got together and talked, getting ready for this event, we talked a little, I think Bill, you said it actually, there are basically three main things you need to do: patching, blocking, authentication, right? And MFA and things like that. What are the foundational elements that have to be in the budget for 2022? And how do you think about that when you're juggling all your different priorities, right? I mean, somebody wants the shiny new object.
Right.
So what are those foundational elements?
Yeah, I think this is absolutely key for people to think through, because if you do zero-based budgeting where you're looking at like for cyber, you're looking at every control, right? And part of assessing the risk to your organization is how important is that, like how big a risk is each control? They're all not the same, right? So somebody getting into your email server with admin credentials is like a disaster. Whereas, maybe one of your suppliers having a critical vulnerability, but they don't have any, like it has a much smaller impact, right? So you have to prioritize using that real impact analysis. And I find that a lot of times people don't prioritize right because they haven't thought through that. And the point that I made to you was, if you patch well, if you keep multi-factor authentication on all your critical systems, and then if you protect your email, I think are like the three most impactful things you can do to secure most enterprises in America. And like the fact that most people are like, yeah, we're good enough on that part. I want to optimize my SIM or something, or I want to I think they should just go back to first principles and make sure those first three are like as close to 100% as you could get, and then start optimizing those other pieces. I don't know, Tunde, if you agree as a CISO here.
Completely agree. I mean, the reality is not all controls are equal, as you said. So depending on where, and again, think about it. Our job for cybersecurity is about risk. It's about managing risk. It's about reducing the most critical risk and reducing the attack surface as much as possible. And the data and trends have shown some things that are basically spelled out. We've seen ransomware, email security, all those things are standing out. Credential burn, account takeover, all those things are happening. So those in itself kind of sell itself. So not investing in those things that are very, very clear in media that you're not thinking about those becomes a lost opportunity, if I was to say so myself. So focusing on the right controls. Listen, getting the foundation right. You alluded to patch management earlier. The reality is most of the vulnerabilities that have been exploited are those ones that have been laying dormant in an environment for a long period of time. It just needs to get done. But because we keep ignoring it and not prioritizing those things, is building the fundamentals, letting the fundamental work for itself, and then driving that forward. So if you do the fundamentals right, and those big things or big threats that are actually happening, covering that, that allows you to have that good success to talk about for sure.
Keith, any thoughts on this one?
I agree 100%. I think going to the first principles is right. I think if I say it differently, what worries me is where you think something's implemented, but it's not. And this is maybe, pivot to something we said when we were preparing for this. I experienced some of the IT footprint and the cyber question as like a fixed cost problem, right? So like it's the same size problem if you're big or you're small, right? Because you need a certain list of products in the mix, and maybe you can move them into a per unit kind of consumption model so they flex a little bit, but at some point they sort of bottom out at a fixed cost. You need a certain list of capabilities internally in-house in your team, right? So if you don't have that many, if your headcount isn't big enough, how do you get all those capabilities? So now you start sort of time slicing on fractional people and things like that. So you move to outsourcing model. So for me, where my concern is that something's going to get dropped in the mix because, in my universe, it's a small headcount. So coming back, I completely agree. If you do these things right, and meaning, you're doing it through and through, right? Not just I have a patching solution, but did it actually work, right? And what didn't we patch? And have we scoped it right? Are we covering Internet of Things, right? Are we not? Like those are the kinds of things that I kind of think about in first principles. And absolutely, I think we even experience it too, that you can get caught up in getting to a SIM solution, right? Because it's hot and everybody wants it. And your cyber insurance asks if you have it. And you read the question, you're like, oh, I think I suck. I don't have that. But right, I mean, maybe that's priority 5 or 6. It depends, you know?
I think this is a great point, Keith, but I think that it isn't just smaller organizations when I think about it. And I'd be curious to know, Bill and Tunde, and Keith, you were at a much larger organization, right? So I think this problem exists whenever there's budget downward pressure. You have a fixed size problem, right? And now all of a sudden somebody says, well, the budget has to be cut. There's some external forces, whatever it is. You have this same challenge. How do I deal with something, particularly if it's a fundamental area that I've got to have covered? When there's downward budget pressure and you don't have the funds to get maybe the Rolls-Royce solution in that category or allocate the engineering labor and time to that problem. How do you deal with that, Bill and Tunde?
Yeah, I mean, listen, in a decreasing scenario, it's always hard. I do think though that like, you got to go back to the, is it like Abe Lincoln or something? He's like, if I had an hour to cut down a tree, I'd spend 59 minutes like sharpening the axe. And I think that's what people don't do enough of, right? They immediately start going, okay, what do I like? I'm just going to run everything and then I'm going to slice here and slice there and slice otherwise. Whereas the way to really dramatically increase or decrease a budget is to make a bunch of new investments that are like generational improvements and then cut the budget next year, right? Like, so you have to try to tell that story. Instead, everyone's just like, yeah, they just told me I can't spend anything. And you're like, it's the wrong way to think about it because everyone's fixed on this 1 year time horizon. If you went to your CFO, sometimes there's truly like no money left and that's a different story. But like oftentimes there's some play there, right? And you could say, okay, I'm going to give you an extra 500,000 next year, but I need 150 this year to buy a new product in order to implement it to give you the 500 next year. And like, I think having those multi-year conversations around budgeting is critical, or else you're in this downward spiral of like suboptimal everything because you can never invest anything to make anything better. And you're sort of like, you're watching the same VCR tapes over and over again. You can't get a Netflix subscription, right? Like, so anyway.
I think it's a fantastic. I want to build on that, please, if you don't mind. I mean, there's so much opportunity lost by using new innovation as justification to simplify the spend. Because a lot of things that we've kind of had historically as capabilities that were part of the stack and what we used to do things creates a lot of opportunity for us to say, okay, if we do it a bit differently and identify a different platform to do that, because now teams are more versed. Teams understand, processes have been documented, use cases are in place. Teams know the right things to do. Adjusting a platform to simplify that old story, decommissioning old and bringing in new will actually create a lot of opportunity than vice versa. So still being able to drive change in a situation where your core, you can tweak your core to make more juice available. It's like squeezing juice out of a turnip. It's possible. And many of us do that. And it's something that you can continue to do, especially in that downturn situation.
I feel like one of the best examples of that I've seen throughout my career is in telecommunications, right? There's just constantly opportunities to rip out infrastructure, upgrade to a newer platform. It's an expensive project. It's time consuming. It's labor intensive. And the payoff is like, 5 to 10 years out because you're shaving some numbers of thousands of dollars every single year on OpEx going forward, right? And you see that in a lot of other places, but it feels like in telecom, that's the story every day, all day. if you're willing to do it and you can convince the organization that that should be some part of your budget and your priority for the year.
Yeah. The thing that I've been searching for on this, Josh, is like, what people want. I've yet to meet a single organization that says, we've got all the tech we need, please do less, right? There's always new priorities for automation and improvement and margin increase using technology as the tool set, right? And because of that, like velocity of how quickly you can deliver new business capabilities using technology is like, that's the metric that every CTO should basically be graded on. And obviously doing it securely and stay in a stable way. Those like stable, secure, those are table stakes, but then velocity of new capabilities that can drive our business results, right? So I think trying to relate everything back to, did it increase my velocity? And by how much? And what does that mean for future years? That's like the metric that I've been searching for the best way to quantify, because it sort of rolls it all up in a way that people could understand if we could get a great way to measure it such that people would believe it.
So I do want to leave a little time for you guys. Great. I want to leave a little time for Q&A, and we do have some questions that are,
cool.
that are showing up for all of you in the chat, and I want to make sure we get to them. First, from Brent Edwards, he says, I often remind myself and clients that our industry is very immature, relative, right, as compared to other areas. Additionally, there's a very high rate of change, i.e. the way a technology ask is accomplished today is very different than the way it was 5 years ago, et cetera. As a result, we all have to be sellers and ways of thinking, as you guys are talking about. How do we think about this? How about those rates of change? Things are happening. I mean, clearly finance has been around for hundreds of years. Technology wasn't really a thing.
Yeah.
Right.
I think being dramatic, like really explaining and making people uncomfortable about like the realities of the world is extremely critical to make this point. Like, we have to sell the fact that like it's just not okay to be incremental and to sort of limp along. Like, we have to, because otherwise the businesses are not going to survive. Like, it is or they'll do okay, but they're not going to thrive like everybody wants them to be. So I think it's a great point. But like, you have to sort of, I think you got to hit people over the head with it, like repeatedly, for them to get it. I went to the university, Singularity University, to hear talks about the coming massive innovations. And some of them seemed a little bit far-fetched, but like, it certainly did open your mind. Like, you know, what's going to happen to the world with autonomous vehicles? What's going to happen if we can, you know, if we can create vaccines for everything? What's going to happen if we change the way medicine is delivered so that it's personalized? And, you know, trying to get people to really think like, wow, things could change dramatically in the world. And then how do you apply that to our business? And then maybe we should be changing a little bit more dramatically than we're all comfortable with.
So here's some questions for each of you. I'll start with you, Tunde, or actually, let me start with you, Keith, because we haven't heard from you in a little bit. What are your top 3 budget priorities for 2022?
So before I go there, I just want to double back for a second. I know you're trying to push us forward, but I think, you know, the velocity of change topic is interesting, because and this may play into the priorities, when you operationalize that, you're thinking about, you know, running IT like it's its own business, and you're thinking about your capabilities. So one part of that is kind of foundational baseline capability, right? So investments I'm making into IT to elevate our general game, right? Make us more flexible, give us better tools or ability to respond fast, right? And then on top of that, now you're looking for the opportunities where there's something that can make a big difference for some part of the business, right? So the bottom layer supports the top layer, so you can really get acceleration out of it, right? I think that's kind of how we think about it. And then, you know, the ability to change people, I think, you know, there's a reason that almost everything kind of clears through IT. You ever notice that when anybody has a question, they always ask IT? So like, why does IT seem to know everything? Our fingers are in everything. We need to use that to come back and go after, for example, the accounting team and challenge them, you know, in their own language, on their own field, with why are we not thinking a different way about the problems that we're trying to solve and where we can get good value and innovation. So trying to come back to your question, my top 3 are, you know, things that are going to help us simplify. So investments in the middle office for operational efficiency, streamlining treasury software, things like that. Another one is going to be continued investment in improving our cyber posture. I think that that's still relevant, but measured, right? Those are my top two. I'm going to leave it at two for right now.
That's great. Bill, what are your top three?
I think that what I'm hearing most is continued march to the cloud. People are much less in the cloud than everybody thinks they are, and like paying off legacy debt, modernizing applications, and really getting like the foundational pieces continue to grow that so that you can create velocity in your organizations using using the public cloud. Is almost every organization's in some 0 to 10 phase, but I haven't met many that are at 10. So they gotta continue up along that journey.
So now that Bill has stolen my points, I feel like I need to say it in a different way because that's exactly what I was going to say. But John, so I mean, if you think about the way you did development before, changing the way you did development by taking advantage of the new modern capabilities, so you can do it safer, you can do it with quality, you can do it with security built in. Those are those things of and just protecting the life cycle of data. If you think about all the big impacts that's happened today, it's all about data. So getting more data hygiene from a security perspective and a life cycle perspective becomes a very, very key part of that journey.
Okay, so very specific question here. What comes to mind? What is one new technology you're adding to the budget for 2022? And particularly I would encourage you each to think about the one where you think people are going to get the biggest impact. Let's go back to you, Tunde.
Is this where you have to say patch management solution from Aiden?
No.
I think that's why he's trying to slip it. But, okay, so let me be contrarian and say basically, really risk-based vulnerability prioritization and remediation of it. So let's just say that.
Very good. Bill?
I think a lot of it comes down to data quality. Ways to make sure your data is in a state where you could really make best use of it. Hearing that across lots of organizations and often gets ignored.
Keith?
I think managed solutions. So opportunity to find more scale and operational resource through the selection of a partner. So not just technology, but technology that somehow comes with, be it AI resources or some way that it achieves what the software is meant to achieve without needing my internal resources to do it.
Appreciate the plug. All right, I want to make sure we have enough time to get to this. We promised everybody we'd wrap up with some key takeaways. We have a minute left. Tunde, after the whole discussion, what are some key thoughts or takeaways or poignant words that stood out to you today about thoughts around budgeting for 2022?
Think about the opportunities of the things that you've done successfully and build on that. There's so much to be said about building on the success of the way you've done it over the last. I mean, like I said, the new DNA of who we are today as technology is very different from where we used to be. So build on the successes of how you've done it recently and continue to drive from that direction because the value can be seen there.
I love that. Build on your successes. Bill, what's a key takeaway?
Think long-term and try to be more simple. Empty the backpack out of all your complexity. That's what's going to make you able to run faster.
I love the George Clooney analogy, Bill. I love it. Keith, what's your biggest takeaway?
I would say it's to not be a CIO or CTO, but think like a CEO, right? And express and frame your value proposition, speak the language of your business partners so that you can get the buy-in, right? Stay transparent, show them the decision-making, and then you can really drive the strategy that you're trying to achieve.
Yeah, I summed that similar sentiment up. My key takeaway is we have to be sellers. Technologists have to be sellers. We have to get into that conversation. And if we're not comfortable with it, then we have to challenge ourselves and do some professional development to get comfortable with it, or we can't get these things through.
Well said.
Gentlemen, this
100%.
was fantastic. I really appreciate all of your time today. Tunde, Bill, Keith, great dialogue. I hope our audience out there appreciates all the time and all the experience and wisdom coming through in this conversation. And thank you so much for the time today. Look forward to seeing you guys soon.
Thanks, Josh.
Pleasure.
Thanks, team.
Thanks.